to Leading for Life Stories Season 4. I'm Bob Judson. I'm the host for this podcast, and thank you very, very much indeed for joining me. Whether you're a new joiner or a seasoned listener, then I really, really hope you enjoy the mix of content that we provide. The personal stories, the thematic episodes, and of course, the fantastic guest interviews. If you've been with me since the beginning, then I'm enormously grateful for your loyalty and thank you so much. If you're relatively new to the show, then I really hope you like it and I hope you find all of it interesting and some of it hopefully useful to you. Please subscribe on whichever channel it is you're using, whether it's YouTube, whether it's a podcast platform. That really helps us boost the show and get it over the hills on the algorithms. So if you can do that for me, I would be enormously grateful. But without further ado, let's go. Hi, everyone. I hope you've had a great week and you're enjoying, if you're anywhere around the UK and watching or listening to this just about the time I'm going to be releasing this episode, enjoying the fabulous weather that we're having as well. Interestingly, when I think about the way I put these episodes together, quite often I've got guest interviews lined up and I've got stuff kind of racked and stacked and ready to go. But just occasionally I end up in periods where I haven't really got that. And then other stuff happens. So this week, for example, I was asked at very short notice to go and support a Deloitte University course over in Paris. So I did that. I got back last night, actually early hours of this morning by the time the flight was late, and then I got back late on the train. And today I had a bunch of stuff to do, and then I've got to get the podcast out for tomorrow. So it got me thinking about what I could talk about this time, because I wanted to do a thematic episode anyway, and I was kind of mulling over the list I've got of various options. But then I thought pressure would be a good one today, because there is pressure for me now. I'm under a bit of time pressure to get the recording done, get the edit done, get the upload done, so it's all ready to go. And I hit my 12 o'clock Sunday release date, which I've consistently managed to do for the entire life of the podcast, which is rapidly approaching 3 years. So, I thought it was quite a good topic, not least because everyone feels it to some degree. Everybody feels pressure. It's how you handle it that counts, of course. But pressure comes in all sorts of forms. It's personal, it's professional through your work life. It can be event-based, specific stuff that happens and derails you, and you have to react in the moment. And how you deal with that under pressure really, really matters. If you're a leader, how you lead your team under pressure, how you lead yourself, how you manage yourself, and still look cool, calm, collected under pressure really counts. Think about an airline pilot. When stuff goes wrong, I mean, most of the time an airline pilot or airline crew at the flight deck level are sat at the controls monitoring largely what goes on with the airplane. Apart from the takeoff and landing, a lot of the rest of the flight will be on autopilot. The time they really earn their corn is when stuff goes wrong and they have to deliver, and they do a lot of training for that in the simulator and so on, and very little live, obviously, unless it actually happens. But look at Sully Sullenberger and the Miracle on the Hudson. The ability to respond and react under real pressure and deliver the right outcome, whilst at the same time actually maintaining your cool, maintaining a calm, level head, thinking through the problem, working the issues. These are things that really, really matter in the pressure department. And so I thought it was worth an episode because they'd be worth talking about. Because I think there might be a few things in my own life that you can think about, a few tips that I think are potentially helpful, and just something that you, again, can look in the mirror a little bit and go, how do I manage this myself? Because pressure comes in various forms. It's not just those sort of three big buckets I talked about, personal, work, and events, but if you think about the things that induce pressure for you, I mean, just a few tiny examples. Critical timelines. If you've got a timeline that you've got to achieve and you're behind, it's putting you under pressure. If you're running late for something, no matter how you've managed to get in that situation, it's putting you under pressure. How do you manage that? How do you solve that particular issue? Short deadlines. Someone asks you to do something and it's got to be done yesterday, and you've got to prioritize, you've got to change what you're doing, you've got to then deliver the goods with a product in a very short space of time. How does that feel? How do you manage to deal with the pressure? How do you manage the team, if there's a team involved in that, without looking like you're firefighting, looking like you're catastrophizing the whole thing? And that I think is a incredibly important thing to give some thought to and actually work through in your own personal development how you actually deal with those kind of situations, because sooner or later this is going to happen to you without a doubt. You are going to face some significant moment or significant issues that you're going to have to manage for yourself or for your team or both, and therefore I think it's a reasonably important topic. Avoiding it is obviously a prime consideration here. If you can do that, if you can manage to keep yourself in a world where by and large you don't get yourself under pressure, you always manage your timelines well, you never run late for anything, you're always prepared and well ahead of the game for short notice stuff, then actually that's great. That's obviously going to make a huge, huge difference to you in terms of getting you in a space where your mindset is, that you're insulating yourself, I suppose, from pressure events. However, if you're not careful, that can make it worse when there is actually a pressure event. So you do need to think about that's not a cure for this. That's just basically going to be helpful to minimize the amount of times you actually have to deliver under real pressure. But there's plenty of opportunity where you would probably really still need to focus on being able to deal with pressure in the moment as it happens. I think it's really important to know yourself in here as well. I mean, different people handle pressure events very differently. It can lead to stress, obviously, significant amounts of stress, and how you deal with that stress personally, again, is something that you need to know about yourself. Are you the kind of person that just basically doesn't really get stressed, just works through this, just works the problem, just sorts it all out? Wonderful if you are in that kind of space. There is a level of training, I think, that can get you to that. I think the military has been very good from my point of view in terms of helping me with that, because what you want to do is you want to build up your, I suppose, tolerance, and so you understand where your own limits are. And again, that's quite a helpful thing to be able to do. If I look back to my flying training days, one of the things that going through fast jet flying training, the instructors constantly did was they would always look to load you up with more stuff, more stuff, more stuff. And there was a reason for that. Even if you were coping brilliantly with it, what they wanted to do was they wanted to find and then expand your capacity limits, your mental capacity limits. Because the first thing you saw in flying, and I saw this plenty of times when I was in supervisory roles, when individuals find themselves running out of capacity, they're running out of bandwidth to deal with all the issues that they're facing, and they really are starting to feel the pressure, is they stop hearing things. Their hearing goes a little bit, so they start missing radio calls, missing intercom calls. They start being a bit limited in terms of what they're doing with lookout. They're not coping very well in terms of the overall mission. They're really focused on the instant near-term priority and not getting out beyond that. They're looking at the end of the bonnet of the car, if you like, and they're not looking beyond the vehicle at all. And you clearly don't want to be in that situation. So understanding a pilot's capacity in the training system was really, really important. And if I look back to, again, my own time, the thing probably that washed out more people, particularly from the fast jet world and particularly within the fast jet world from single seat to two seat, was capacity. The more capacity you have, the more ability you have to basically cope with more stuff being dumped on you and just manage it and work it through and still not be defeated. That actually is mental capacity that is really, really helpful and puts you in a really good place to do something like flying a fast jet airplane, which does require a good deal of that. So from my point of view, when I look at my life now, I think actually that mental capacity aspect and the fact that over years I had many, many occasions when that capacity was pushed to the limit, and then that expands the limit every time you do that. Your cup gets a bit fuller and then you get a bit of a bigger cup because you've been there before. You can potentially expand it a little bit, and you know where your stretch zone goes to. And that's really, really helpful because you can get yourself in a position where you understand how you're dealing with something, what you're going to do, getting your mindset in the right place to manage the problem, work the problem, think through it logically, not just fall apart in the moment under some kind of pressure event. Now, I suspect pretty much everyone has a limit beyond which they would ultimately still, start to show real signs of stress and potentially poor performance. But again, if you look back to the astronauts on Apollo 13, very famously, huge problem out there in outer space in the Apollo era where technology was not what it is now, having to work the problem to sort out how they were going to get back with obviously the support of everyone on the ground that was working the problem with them. But dealing with that kind of pressure when you know that lives are on the line is incredibly important and incredibly difficult. So that's why I say I think it's important to know yourself. I think it's really important to have a bit of a personal gauge about how you manage these kind of things and having coping mechanisms that work for you. Now, there's a couple of ways you can do that. If you are brilliant at managing this stuff yourself and you know that you've got a lot of capacity, you know you don't fall apart under pressure, you respond well to pressure events, and you can cope under most circumstances, well, that's great. Then just carry on doing what you're doing and just be conscious that at some point there might be a limit that might still test you. If, on the other hand, you are one of these people whose stress bucket gets filled up really, really fast because when you're under pressure, you get really stressed and you know you have a challenge dealing with that, then you need to think about, how am I going to delegate this quickly? How am I going to make sure that I've got mechanisms that are going to allow me to continue being effective whilst I'm dealing with a pressure problem that I've got to handle? So some of the time that can be you taking those kind of steps. Some of the time you may be in a position where you really don't recognize this yourself. You just carry on filling your bucket, and you don't actually appreciate that you're becoming more and more stressed. I've told the story before about a former boss of mine who, when I was on a squadron years ago now, was in a position where he was clearly not really himself, and we ended up having a pretty frank conversation where I just challenged him. I said, hey boss, what's up? You're not you. You're obviously, there's something on your mind. And he then sort of unloaded a whole load of stuff on me for pretty much an hour of all these issues that were bothering him, which were just mini pressure events, many things that were adding to his stress bucket that in and of themselves were relatively small, but cumulatively the impact was very significant. And that was a real moment for him where he recognized that actually he probably needed to find a slightly different way of doing this. And he has talked about that to me in the past as well. And we're still good friends to this day. And I think it was definitely a moment for him, which he still remembers. But ultimately, the only person that can manage some of these events is you. You can have people who will support you, people who look out for you, people who will spot that you're under pressure. You may be looking out for your own team to make sure that the individuals within the team aren't under too much pressure and trying to balance the load and making sure that they're able to cope. But there will still potentially be occasions, particularly on the event-based pressure side of life, where you are the only person that can manage the situation. And you need to think about that. You need to be acutely aware, how am I going to deal with this in the moment when it all goes south in a hurry? Now, I'm going to tell a story here that I don't think I've told previously on the podcast, at least not in as much detail. And I think it kind of gives you a flavor of where I'm coming from, because I used to do a lot of scuba diving. I do a lot less now. I still love scuba diving, but I don't do a great deal of it these days. And when I was doing it seriously back in probably the early 2000s, and very, very end of the 90s, early 2000s, I got quite into a thing called technical diving. Now, technical diving, for those in the know, is beyond recreational diving. So you're going deeper, potentially using mixed gases or different gases. So not just diving with air tanks on a recreational dive as you would for a lot of resort type diving. You're using either rich mix oxygen or ultimately trimix gas. So you're taking out oxygen and nitrogen to let you go really deep. And I won't get into all the technicalities of how that works. But I was doing some of this training to do really deep diving, and we were diving to 60 meters, which is pretty deep, on air, and then decompressing, because very quickly, if you're at that depth, you incur a decompression obligation that you have no direct ascent to the surface. You have to off gas some of that nitrogen that you're absorbing into your bloodstream all the time that you're at serious depth. And you do that predominantly by breathing rich mix gas. So you'll have a high concentration of oxygen in your cylinders. You'll have extra cylinders you're carrying that are so-called stage tanks that you'll be breathing on when you're at a depth that you can breathe off those. Now, just to be technical for a second here, the partial pressures of the different gases are really, really important. So if you're diving to 60 meters on air, that is about the limit that you can dive to without the oxygen becoming toxic to you. If you're going deeper than 60 meters, you need to start taking some of that oxygen out, usually replacing it with helium, and that's what's called trimix diving. But I was diving with 21% oxygen and 78% nitrogen, essentially, and then obviously the small gases at that make up the excess, and so just bog standard air. And then I had, as a gas to decompress on, 60% oxygen and 40% nitrogen. So, just basically a much richer mix of oxygen. Now, that richer mix of oxygen is obviously unusable at the depth I'm diving at 60 meters. So you ascend gradually, and then you get to a point at which it's safe, the partial pressure is safe for you to go on to that rich mix oxygen, and then you spend a chunk of time on that, and that helps because it's got a lot more oxygen and a lot less nitrogen. It helps to flush the nitrogen out of your system. And ultimately, this is all about stopping you getting the bends, if you like, decompression sickness, which is the primary enemy of scuba divers. So we were training, we were doing a dive. It was 2 students and 1 instructor, very, very experienced instructor in the Red Sea. He'd done some really hugely deep dives, sort of record-setting type stuff. And I got on really well with him. We had a great rapport, and we're doing some incredibly good, incredibly challenging diving. And I loved the on the technical diving side, the technical aspects of this, the fact that you had to plan very carefully what depth you were going to be at, how much gas you were going to be using, when you were going to start ascending, how long you were going to stay on the various stops you were at to decompress, when it was going to be safe to come back to the surface. All of this stuff was all part of the planning process you went through as part of the preamble for the dive, and then obviously getting your kit ready and getting into the water and making sure the whole dive was conducted in a very technically competent fashion. And the way you do this kind of diving, if you've ever done any recreational scuba diving, you'll probably have talked about the buddy process. So you're diving usually with a buddy, another diver who is going to stay with you come what may, and potentially share air with you and all that sort of thing, and surface with you if there's a problem. Technical diving isn't like that. Technical diving is much more about personal redundancy, because you always do have this issue where you have an obligation on decompression. And therefore you don't want to be potentially taking someone else to the surface and really hazarding their life if ultimately it's just on you, and you've got to manage that yourself. So you carry serious redundancy in your kit. You'll have separate cylinders with isolation valves between them for your main gas, separate stage tanks with your decompression gas. You'll carry 2 masks. You'll have basically 2 of everything pretty much. So you have a very clear plan, and you'll have a bailout plan as well as a main plan. And we were diving at a place called Thomas Reef in the Red Sea out of Sharm el Sheikh, which near there is a little canyon, and the canyon is a split really in the sea floor at about 25 meters depth, and then you can go down in this canyon, which initially is very narrow and very deep. And we go down in that to 60 meters, and the topography is amazing. I mean, it's a spectacular view. And so we then stopped at exactly 60 meters, and you then stay at that depth for the planned amount of time. And because we're on a training course, what the instructor was doing while we were doing our dive and enjoying the scenery and doing a kind of normal dive was he would come and do things just to test our knowledge and our capability and our responses to critical failures. So he would do things like come up behind you and he'd literally take your mask off your head. So you're now diving with no mask on, which obviously, salt water, vision becomes very blurry, all the rest of it. So there is a technique to this. You just get your spare mask out, you put that on, you clear your mask, job done, sorted, all fine. And he'd do that kind of thing to you. He would also then come and give you air failures. So he would simulate by pressing the purge button on your regulator that you had a runaway free flow on your regulator. You would have to then isolate your cylinders, switch to your other regulator, so you're actually just breathing off your back gas. That would obviously for real automatically put you into a bailout situation. But then he would give you the okay that right, that's fine, you can go back to your normal rig again. Now, the other thing I didn't mention here is when you're diving at that kind of depth, the nitrogen, I've mentioned the oxygen being toxic if you go much deeper, but the nitrogen at that kind of depth gives you a thing called nitrogen narcosis, which the best analogy is basically makes you feel a bit lightheaded, almost as if you've been drinking, and it can definitely affect your conscious actions and your precision in what you're doing and your decision making. And you get better as you do more deep dives. You build up a resilience to it, you get more tolerant of it, but it is still a thing. And so we were doing this dive, and we as I was going along, you check your gauges all the time. You're making sure everything's fine. You're looking at the amount of gas you've still got and the amount you've used and whether that's against the plan and how that's all looking. And I was conscious that I was a bit behind the air plan. In other words, I was using a bit more air than I had planned to use. And that's not surprising because we were doing all this stressy stuff where, that was definitely building your heart rate up. So you're breathing a bit faster and you're using a bit more gas. But I thought, well, okay, I'll be fine. I'm sure it's not that bad. I'm not too far behind the plan. And the way the canyon worked is we were swimming along the canyon gradually deepens and opens out as you get into more kind of almost open ocean. So we've come out of the canyon and we're turning back to the reef. We're just about to turn back to the reef, which is kind of behind us at this point. And the instructor gave me another series of emergencies that I had to work through, and they were quite complex ones, and took me a minute or two to resolve that. And I got it done, got it sorted, all fine. He then said, right, okay, let's go back to the reef. Signaled us that we're doing that. We turned to go back to the reef, and at the point we turned, I am number 3 in a line of 3. So I'm at the back of the queue, if you like, heading back towards the reef, which isn't physically that far away. It's probably 100, maybe less meters away from us. No real current, so that wasn't a major problem. But the real thing was we're deep. We're at 60 meters. We're just about to start ascending. And my sort of nearest diving companion is probably a body length ahead of me. So he's enough distance ahead of me that it wasn't kind of easy just to reach out and touch him. And at that point, I felt a tightening in my regulator, which I knew from drills we'd done previously and training we'd done previously. This is an indication that basically you're running out of gas. You have no more gas in the cylinder. And I looked at my gauges and was genuinely horrified to see that essentially I had run out of my back gas. So the 2 cylinders of air I had breathed all of that, and I have now run out of air at 60 meters with no ascent to the surface, about a 25 to 30 minute decompression obligation that I've got to service to go back up to the surface safely. I've got 2 cylinders of 60% oxygen and 40% nitrogen strapped to me, which are very toxic at that kind of depth. I needed to get back up to a much shallower depth in order to turn around and be able to use those. So when you talk about pressure, going back to the topic of the podcast, this was one of those moments when event-based pressure was just a car crash of a moment for me. I was looking at a genuinely life-threatening emergency that had come upon me as a complete surprise through my own incompetence. It was my fault I'd got to that position, and I'd obviously not tracked my gas enough. I knew I was behind, but I hadn't followed it up. The last sort of series of drills had made me use yet more gas. Therefore, I got to a point where I'd not only used my kind of reserves, I'd obviously breathed way too much, and it just ran down to zero. And I'll never really know exactly what happened with that. And that's kind of almost academic at this point anyway. The reality was I am now, with a lung full of air, having just taken my last breath out of my back gas, going, oh shit, I've got to decide how I'm going to get out of this situation. Now, if I had panicked, I would have died. There is no question about that. I had to turn around and not do that. I had to put I could die in this situation thought right to the back of my mind, not catastrophizing what could go on. That was never going to be a solution to this. And what I had to do is work the problem. And working the problem in the space of literally, split seconds was something I was familiar with doing from my flying background, and my military training without a doubt saved me here. And the mind management element of that, my own personal capacity, which is pretty high. I've been a single seat pilot for all of my career. I was able to work through this and think through the various connotations. So what I actually did was immediately started ascending slowly, conscious that I couldn't ascend too quickly, because obviously if you ascend too quickly, you're going to get the bends as well. And so going up, basically your bubbles go up faster than you is the general rule of thumb. And I was doing that. And I was also aware and very clear in my mind that obviously as you ascend, the air in everything, but including in your lungs, expands. So you get more air, if you like, as you start ascending. So even though I've got a breath of air in my body, if I breathe out slowly, then I'm getting best use out of that air that's there. But it's still not going to solve the problem because I'm still way too deep to make it to the surface with a single breath. And even then, I couldn't go straight to the surface because I had the decompression obligation. So the next thing I was thinking about is, okay, what am I going to do? I need to be basically at 25 meters to be able to use the gas that I had, if memory serves me correctly. And that was where our plan was to get to 25 meters and stop there and switch to the rich mix gas. So I worked on a risk assessment basis. Again, we're talking split seconds here while I'm dealing with this situation on my own in the middle of the Red Sea, thinking, okay, I can take a risk and actually prep my cylinders, breathe a breath off my rich mix gas, not start breathing that heavily, but make use of that to get me to a safe depth where I can use it continuously. And that's exactly what I did. So I worked through that. It basically took a breath of rich mix oxygen, work on the basis that, one breath probably wasn't going to be a major drama, and in low it wasn't. And then I got myself to 25 meters, sorted myself out, was able to breathe more regularly, and at that point was pretty much back at the reef. And so I gave a little pinch hold on the reef to just stabilize myself and stay at the depth I needed to be at, and kind of calm the heart rate down a little bit and think about, right, what am I now going to do? And obviously, the other thing that had happened here is I've now disappeared from the other two. So the other two have no idea where I've gone. I have ascended much more quickly than the plan, because the plan was a much more staged ascent than I had done. And the instructor and obviously the other student really had no clue what had happened to me. They then did find me, because I was obviously on it's a pretty small reef, Thomas Reef, and the instructor came and found me. No comms, obviously, but through signals and bits, he kind of worked out what had happened to me. And we were on the bailout plan. Then we went through the full decompression obligation on a rich mixed gas, and then got back on the boat. And then had, as you'd imagine, a pretty full and frank debrief about exactly what had happened, how I dealt with it, and all the rest of it. That story, I mean, that dates back 20 odd years for me, more than probably 25 years. And you probably tell from the level of detail that I've gone into that, I mean, it really was a major moment for me. It was one of my significant life moments where I realized that I absolutely could have died doing this. Did that put me off? Not a bit of it, because that's just not my style. I'm very much a get on the horse guy and get back in and do it again. And that's exactly what we did. And we talked that through as well in terms of the training course, because it was an invaluable set of lessons, not just for me actually, but for the other student on the course, and the instructor as well learned some stuff out of it, I think. But it was for sure a direct benefit of the military training, the mind management element, the work in the problem, the not catastrophizing it, the thinking about how you're going to go through it stage by stage, was without doubt something that made a difference. If any of you have seen the movie The Martian with Matt Damon, he talks about this in the movie, in his role. At the end of it, when he's been stranded on Mars, it was about working a problem, then working the next problem, then working the next problem, and eventually, if you've worked and solved enough problems, then you're going to find a solution that's going to get you back to where you need to be. And in his case, that was back to Earth. And although it's a fictional story, the moral is the same. It absolutely is the case. I think working the problem under pressure really, really counts. If you are a catastrophizer, if you're a worrier, if you're a very stressy person, none of this is really going to help you, because you're probably not going to be in a position where you're going to deal with it in the same way. And another scuba diving story, just to exemplify that, was another Red Sea dive. This time a recreational dive. where I was diving with a buddy that I didn't know before the week that was I'd gone out on my own for the week. And this guy was a nice guy. He was a good diver. We'd been diving together, for the previous few days. And we dropped into the water with some other divers that we didn't know at all on what's called a wall dive. So it's very deep water. It's 2,000 meters deep. So obviously, it's clearly you're not going down anything like that. You're going down to 30 meters max. And it's a very pretty reef. And there was a woman who had jumped in just ahead of us, and we're on the surface waiting to descend. She'd got separated from her buddy a little bit as we dropped into the water, and was stressing herself already about that a little bit. And I said, look, don't worry. The current is going to bring her back as soon as we descend. She's going to come back to us. So, let's just, we'll stay with you, and, you'll be fine. Anyway, so the instructor then gives us the descent signal, and, down we go. And if you had thrown a rock into the water, it would have not descended as quickly as this woman did when she basically emptied the air out of her buoyancy compensator. She went down quicker than a stone, which was absolutely not the intent. The idea is you go down nice and slowly and steadily and progressively, and then you're all doing everything in a very controlled and calm manner. I realized instantly what had happened here. She was massively overweighted. She was carrying too much lead to compensate for for her in terms of getting her down. And so I just basically I inverted myself and swam, finned down fast, grabbed hold of her, and the picture that greeted me as I grabbed hold was telling me 1,000 words. Really, but it was better than 1,000 words. It was basically giving me the absolute clarity that had I not done what I'd done, she would never have come back from that dive, because she had no idea what was going on. Her eyes were wide as saucers. She was doing anything but working the problem and not dealing with the pressure of the moment at all. And all she needed to do was start putting more air back into her buoyancy compensator, sort herself out, get herself back into in a sensible position. But as it was, she was going down really fast. She lost control of it. She didn't understand how that was going to work. So I put air into her buoyancy compensator, sorted her out, got her back to a place where she was absolutely fine. We completed the dive. We never saw her buddy again for the rest of the dive, which was a conversation all of its own when we got back on the boat. But again, there were some pretty clear words on the debrief about what she needed to think about and how she'd actually needed to sort of up her training game on this. But I use the story as an example of the opposite of what I did. If you don't work the problem, if you don't have an ability to manage a very stressful, very difficult, in that case, very dangerous situation, then you are undoubtedly putting yourself in serious jeopardy. So if you know that you are a bit of a catastrophizer, a bit of a worrier, and a bit stressy, you need to think about, how am I going to actually get myself some help to minimize the problem if and when the problem arises. And we've talked about avoiding it, planning it, having more flexibility in your planning, so you'll do your absolute best to avoid putting yourself under pressure. Don't leave things to the last minute, which is just going to stress you out when you haven't done them, etc., etc. But you still have to have a set of tools that are going to help you. And things like neurolinguistic programming can help with this, and any NLP practitioner can talk you through anxiety techniques that will help manage your anxiety. Also, therapy. If you're ultimately at that level, you can go and start talking to therapists about stress management and cognitive behavioral therapy, etc., which can make a really big difference to you. But it's really important that you do this look in the mirror thing. And that's why I wanted to talk about this, because I think it's something that we all kind of just take for granted. That there's pressure out there. There's lots of pressure on people in all sorts of ways. Some of it's long-term pressure around cost of living and those sorts of things at the moment. Some of it's short-term immediate problems when something's gone wrong and you're having to deal with it. And often, sadly, these things happen in multiples. It's not at all unusual that you end up dealing with things that are cumulatively piling on, because things happen in threes, is the old joke, and it almost is true. So you have to be ready to deal with multiple stressful events and get yourself through that. I hope that just illuminating the problem a little bit and giving you a kind of my own experiences and my own thoughts is helpful here. And it's another one of these ones that's a combination almost of a personal story and a thematic episode. This time it's more thematic than personal. But I do think that the personal examples matter, and you need to think about how you're going to manage your own pressure events, stress events. What are you going to do? How good are you at working the problem and not catastrophizing it? And if you're not good, then think about what coping strategies you can put in place to help yourself, because it makes a difference. That's it. I hope you've enjoyed it. As ever, please let me know what you think. Let me have some feedback. Be back again soon with another one. Take care. Bye now. I really hope you've enjoyed this short episode talking about pressure and my experiences of dealing with a couple of pressure events. One for me and one for somebody else in terms of the way that's played out. I could talk for a lot longer about lots of other events and times when pressure's been on, and I'll probably do some of those on different episodes. But if you've enjoyed it and you think it's worth sharing, please share it. Please like it, comment on it when I post on social media about it. Please comment in the podcast platforms and give me a review. That would be really kind. Please do subscribe, whether you're watching on YouTube or any of the other podcast platforms. Please do follow, subscribe, whatever it happens to be, because those algorithms really make a difference and help boost the podcast. And if you really like it and you really find some of this stuff valuable and useful to you, then do think about what I always ask for, which is a bit of thought about financial support. Because if you can give me back some value for the value I'm giving you, I would be extremely appreciative. And you can do that through the support the show link in the show notes that you'll find in YouTube or in any other podcast platforms, or just go direct to patreon.com, www.patreon.com/leading4life, and then you'll find me, and you can join as either a supporter, a champion, or a patron of the show. And any one of those, not particularly expensive, going to make a really big difference to what I do as well, though. So I would be hugely appreciative. It's all about marginal gains for me in terms of trying to offset some of the costs of doing the podcast and getting back some of the investment from it. If you're up for that, I'll be delighted. As always, though, I'm delighted to have you here anyway. Thank you very much indeed for joining, and I hope you found it useful. See you next week. Bye now.